The late afternoon sun spilled through the lace curtains of Christina Adams' sunroom in Auckland, painting long golden lines across the polished wooden floor. It was the kind of room people expected an older woman to settle into quietly, a room for tea, for knitting, for silence, for waiting. But Christina Adams was not waiting. At 78 years old, she sat in the middle of open suitcases, Korean English phrasebooks, and a stack of freshly notarized documents that still smelled like ink and bold decisions. Her daughter, Sarah, stood nearby holding a glossy retirement brochure like it was a final lifeline. "Mom, please," Sarah said. "Just look at this one more time. The Palms has a heated pool, 24-hour nursing, and everything is easy. You wouldn't have to do a thing." Christina didn't even look up. She was too busy checking her passport again. "I spent 40 years being the nurse on site," she said. "I have done enough not doing a thing for one lifetime." Her son David paced across the room, tense and restless. "It's Seoul, Mom," he said. "Not a quiet town. A real city. Huge, fast, crowded. You don't speak the language? The hills are steep. And what if something happens? What if you fall? What if my heart finally beats for something again?" The words hit the room like thunder. Christina stood to her full height, straight-backed and steady, silver hair twisted into a neat knot that somehow looked both elegant and rebellious. She crossed to the mantel and picked up a framed print of the Sinai Desert. Her fingers moved over the image of Moses leading a people through impossible ground. Then she turned back to her children. "You both speak about my age like it's a diagnosis," she said quietly. "Like 78 means I have moved from the living column into the waiting room." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Mom?" But Christina kept going. "For months, I've been praying," she said. "I asked God one question. Am I done?" She paused, and every single time I closed my eyes, I did not see a retirement villa in Auckland. I saw Seoul. I saw Gangnam. I saw children who had forgotten how to sing. Sarah looked shaken. "It's dangerous. You're elderly." Christina turned and gave her a look so sharp it cut straight through the fear. "Moses was 80 when he stood before Pharaoh," she said. 80. Caleb was 85 when he asked for his mountain. So tell me this, Sarah. Do you really think the Holy Spirit retires at 65 and takes up lawn bowls? Neither of them answered, because suddenly they weren't looking at a fragile grandmother. They were looking at a woman standing on the edge of something holy. Christina leaned forward, her voice low and full of fire. "As long as there is breath in these lungs, my chapter is not over. I am not going to Seoul to hide. I am going because, for the first time in years, I feel awake." The room fell silent. And in that silence, her children finally saw it. Their mother was not fading. She was being called. The next morning, Auckland International Airport smelled like coffee, cold air, and goodbye. Christina hugged her grandchildren tightly, breathing in the scent of shampoo, childhood, and the life she loved. Then she picked up her bag, adjusted the strap on her shoulder, and walked toward the departure gate with a small leather Bible in her carry-on and a one-way ticket that felt more like a key than a boarding pass. As the plane lifted over the Hauraki Gulf, she looked out the window and watched New Zealand grow smaller beneath her. Then she leaned back, closed her eyes, and whispered, "Lord, I've got my staff in my hand. Show me the sea. You're going to part?" This was not the beginning of a slow ending. This was the beginning of a mission. By the time she landed in Incheon, Christina felt less like she had arrived somewhere new and more like she had stepped into the next chapter of a calling that had been waiting on her for years. And when the taxi rolled into Gangnam, she pressed against the window like a girl seeing the world for the first time. Everything moved, everything flashed, everything glowed. Towering digital billboards lit the streets in electric pink and blue. Scooters darted through traffic. The air carried the scent of sesame, roasted coffee, rain on concrete, and a city that never seemed to blink. Then the taxi stopped. The driver pointed between two sleek corporate towers. Here, Halmayoni. Christina stepped out onto the pavement, her sensible leather shoes clicking softly against the ground. And there it was. The Agape Youth Center. Tucked in the shadows of modern glass giants, the building looked small, old, and stubborn. Its red brick exterior was weathered by time and smog, and the sign above the entrance hung slightly crooked. But even so, it stood there like a prayer that had refused to die. Christina adjusted her scarf, checked her reflection in a nearby shop window, and pushed open the heavy oak door. Inside, the center felt completely different from the city outside. No neon, no noise, no glittering pace, just the scent of floor wax, old sheet music, and something else. Something colder than silence. Then she heard it. A piano. Technically perfect, emotionally empty. Every note was clean, precise, sharp, and completely dead. "Excuse me? Annyeonghaseyo?" Christina called, her Kiwi accent curling around the Korean greeting. A man stepped out from a side office. He looked like he had been carved from stone and dressed by discipline itself. His suit was immaculate. His white hair was swept back with military precision. His face gave away nothing. This was Elder Moon-soo. He glanced at her suitcase first, then at her. "The tour group is 2 blocks east," he said in crisp English. "This is a private facility. We do not provide public access." Christina blinked. "I'm not here for a tour." Moon-soo checked his watch. "I'm Christina Adams," she continued, "the volunteer music mentor from the International Mission Board." That made him pause, but not soften. His eyes moved over her age, her scarf, her luggage, and every detail he had already decided did not belong. "There must be some mistake," he said. "I requested a specialist, someone with stamina. This center is under pressure. We are not in a position to host senior experiences." Christina stared at him. Then she let out the kind of breath a woman takes when she realizes the man in front of her is about to learn a lesson the hard way. "I have 40 years of teaching experience," she said, "and a nursing degree. I've survived emergency rooms, choir rehearsals, and raising children. I think I can survive Seoul." Moon-soo stepped closer, his presence cold and imposing. "In this city," he said, "pressure either makes diamonds or crushes bones. These youths need order, not sentiment. They need discipline, not grandmotherly comfort. This is a workplace, Mrs. Adams, not a hobby." Then he moved as if to guide her back toward the door. "I will contact the board," he said. "We can arrange a hotel while a return flight is prepared." That was when Christina planted her feet. She looked up at him with calm, blazing defiance. "Order may be the first law of heaven, Mr. Moon," she said, "but grace is the heartbeat of it." That stopped him. "And from what I heard when I walked in," she continued, "this place has a serious heart problem." Moon-soo's jaw tightened. The piano was technically perfect. "It was dead," Christina said. Silence. Then she lifted her chin and delivered the line that changed everything. "I'm not going to a hotel," she said. "I'm going to my post." For the first time, something flickered in Moon-soo's eyes. Not agreement, not yet, but recognition. Because the woman he had dismissed in less than 30 seconds had just walked into his carefully ordered world and spoken to the one thing he had buried under discipline, pressure, and years of disappointment. The music was alive once, and somehow she had heard its funeral the moment she stepped through the door. Moon-soo said nothing, but Christina already knew one thing. This mission was going to be much bigger than music. The third floor of the Agape Youth Center felt less like a music school and more like a hallway full of sealed-off confessions. Soundproof rooms lined both sides of the corridor. The air smelled like antiseptic, old polish, and pressure. Somewhere behind the walls, metronomes kept beating out the same cold rhythm. Tick, tick, tick. Christina slowed when she reached a door marked Studio 4. Through the narrow glass window, she saw a boy sitting at a keyboard. He looked about 19. His dyed ash blonde hair hung over his eyes, and his shoulders were folded inward like he was trying to disappear inside himself. He wasn't playing. He was just staring at his reflection in the polished black surface of the piano with the kind of exhaustion that looked far too old for his face. "That is Minho." The voice came from behind her. Cold, low, controlled. Christina turned and found Elder Moon-soo standing there with his arms crossed, his jacket buttoned tight, his face unreadable. "He was a grade A trainee at one of the big 3 labels," Moon-soo said. 3 years, 18-hour days. Then they cut him last month because his vocal color no longer matched their new concept. He said it like he was reading from a report. Now he is here to repent through practice. If he is to serve the choir, he must regain discipline. Christina looked back through the glass. "Repent?" she repeated softly. "For being rejected by a corporation?" Her heart clenched. "He doesn't look undisciplined," she said. "He looks like he forgot how to breathe." Moon-soo checked his watch. "He needs structure," he said. "He has 4 hours of scales remaining. Do not interrupt the schedule, Mrs. Adams. Efficiency is the only way out of failure." And with that, he turned and walked away. His footsteps echoed down the hall like a judge leaving the bench. Christina waited until the sound disappeared. Then she did the one thing the handbook would probably hate. She opened the door without knocking. Minho flinched so sharply it was as if he had been expecting a slap instead of a visitor. Christina stepped inside, carrying a thermos and 2 mismatched ceramic mugs. "I don't have a metronome," she said brightly, "but I do have Manuka honey from New Zealand and a very stubborn streak." Minho blinked at her. She set the mugs down and gave him a gentle look. "Your throat looks like it's made of glass, dear," she said. "Drink?" He stared at her like she had walked in from another planet. I have to finish the Hainan exercises," he stammered. "Elder Moon says—" "Elder Moon is not the one with the sore throat," Christina said, gently closing the lid over the keys. Then she looked at him with calm certainty. "God rested on the 7th day, Minho. I think you can rest for 7 minutes." She poured the tea. Immediately, the room changed. The scent of honey and wildflowers drifted into the sterile air, softening something the walls themselves seemed to have forgotten. Minho took the mug carefully, like he didn't quite trust kindness yet. Then he took one sip. His shoulders dropped a little, then more. And suddenly he looked less like a trainee under inspection and more like a tired boy who had not been allowed to be human in a very long time. "They said I was surplus," he whispered. His voice cracked on the word. "I gave them my whole youth. If I'm not a star, then what am I?" Christina pulled up a plastic stool and sat across from him. "You're a masterpiece," she said. She didn't rush the words. She let them land. And masterpieces are not mass-produced in factories, not in Seoul, not anywhere. They are breathed into being by the Creator. Minho looked down. Christina leaned over and pressed one gentle chord on the keyboard. Not an exercise, not a drill, not a correction. Just one soft, wandering chord that felt like a breeze through an open window. Then she smiled. "Play something that makes you feel like a child again," she said. "No grades, no labels, no audition. Just a melody for the one who gave you the gift." For a moment, Minho didn't move. Then his fingers touched the keys. The first notes came out slowly, fragile, uncertain, like someone trying to remember a language they hadn't spoken in years. But then something opened. The melody grew warmer, fuller, braver. It started like a trickle, and then it became a river. A few minutes later, 2 more trainees appeared at the door. One was a girl with deep circles under her eyes. The other was a boy clutching a guitar like it was the only thing keeping him steady. They stood there silently, listening. Christina waved them in. No lecture, no permission slip, just a wave, and somehow that was enough. Within 20 minutes, Studio 4 had completely changed. The guitar came out, the tea was passed around. Someone found a harmony. Someone laughed. It wasn't polished. It wasn't perfect, but for the first time, it was alive. Christina clapped along with the rhythm, her silver hair swaying as she laughed, and the room that had felt like a pressure chamber began to sound like breathing again. Then the door flew open. Elder Moon-soo stood there like a thundercloud in human form. His eyes moved across the room. The mugs, the shifted chairs, the broken formation, the students smiling like they had forgotten they were supposed to be ashamed of themselves. "Mrs. Adams!" His voice cracked through the room like a whip. "This is a house of God, not a playground. You have disrupted the curriculum. Look at this chaos." The room went still. But Christina stood, and instead of shrinking, she smiled. Her eyes were bright, almost glowing under the harsh fluorescent lights. "It's not chaos, Moon-soo," she said. "It's a joyful noise." Then she nodded toward the students. "Look at their faces. For the first time since I got here, they aren't staring at the floor." Moon-soo looked at Minho, and this time Minho didn't drop his eyes. He looked right back at him, not with rebellion, not with fear, but with something Moon-soo clearly had not expected to see: hope. Moon-soo's jaw tightened. Christina could almost see the battle happening behind his face. He wanted to quote rules. He wanted to talk about order, time, and stewardship. He wanted to shut the whole thing down before feeling could spread any further. But the room had changed. The air itself felt different. Something had cracked open, and he knew it. Finally, he spoke. 10 minutes, he said sharply. They have 10 minutes. Then they return to the syllabus. The room exhaled. Moon-soo turned and walked toward the door. Then he stopped without facing her. "And Mrs. Adams?" Christina lifted a brow. "Yes, Elder?" His voice came out gruffer than before. "The scent of that tea is distracting." A beat passed. "Do not bring it into the hallways again." Then he left. Quickly. Almost too quickly. But Christina saw it. The way his fingers lingered against the doorframe for half a second longer than necessary. The way his exit no longer felt like pure anger. She smiled to herself, poured the last of the honey into Minho's cup, and lowered her voice. "The walls are starting to shake, kids," she whispered. Then her eyes sparkled. "And we haven't even reached the high notes yet." The next morning, the air in Gangnam felt sharp and restless, like rain was already on its way. Christina was in the middle of teaching Minho the phrasing of an old Mari hymn when the front doors of the Agape Youth Center slammed open so hard the sound traveled through the whole building. Every head turned. 3 men in expensive Italian suits strode inside like they owned the place. Behind them came a woman with a tablet clutched against her chest like a shield. They didn't knock. They didn't slow down. They didn't even take off their shoes. They carried the kind of cold that had nothing to do with weather. Star K, the entertainment empire that owned half the skyline, had arrived in person. From the mezzanine, Christina looked down just as Elder Moon-soo stepped out of his office. And for the first time since she had met him, he looked smaller. His shoulders, usually stiff with authority, had dropped. His face looked worn. He reached into his pocket for his gold fountain pen, and if you looked closely, you could see the slightest tremor in his hand. Then the lead executive spoke. "Elder Moon-soo," he said smoothly, his voice polished to match his silver tie. "The board has approved the final valuation. Demolition is scheduled for the 1st of next month. We have brought the surrender documents for the deed." Christina froze for half a second. Then she moved. "Wait." Her voice rang through the building so sharply it bounced off the high ceilings. She came down the stairs fast, her bright New Zealand scarf trailing behind her like a battle flag. "You're selling?" she said, staring at Moon-soo. "You're really giving this place away? For what? A luxury mall? A monument to handbags and perfume?" "Mrs. Adams, please," Moon-soo said quietly. He still wasn't looking at her. His voice had none of its usual steel. It sounded hollow. "The market has spoken," he said. "Perhaps this is God's way of telling us our season is over. We are old, Christina. We are relics in a city of glass. Better to retire with dignity than be crushed by progress." Christina stared at him. Then she stepped directly between him and the executives. "Retire?" she repeated. Her eyes narrowed. Moses did not retire when he got to the Red Sea. He didn't look at Pharaoh's army, shrug and say, "Well, I suppose the market has spoken." He stood his ground. The lead executive let out a dry little laugh. "Madam," he said, "this is not the Bible. This is real estate." Then he turned toward Moon-soo and extended the papers. "Elder Moon, the pen." Moon-soo reached for the documents. But before his fingers could touch them, Christina snatched them out of the man's hand. The room gasped. The woman with the tablet looked horrified. One of the executives actually took a step forward in disbelief. But Christina didn't even glance at them. She looked only at Moon-soo. "Tonight," she said quietly. Her voice dropped, but somehow it carried even more weight. "Midnight, on the rooftop." Moon-soo looked at her, stunned. "If you still want to sign after we've talked to the boss, I won't stop you," she said. "But you owe these children, and your own soul, one last night of watchfulness." That night, the rooftop of the Agape Center felt like another world. Below them, Seoul blazed and pulsed, a living circuit board of neon, traffic, and restless ambition. The city hummed beneath the darkness like it never intended to sleep. Christina stood near the old rusted railing, the wind tugging silver strands loose from her hair. A few moments later, Moon-soo joined her. His coat collar was turned up against the cold. His face looked drawn. There were dark shadows beneath his eyes now, like exhaustion had finally started writing itself across his skin. "Why are we here, Christina?" he asked. His voice cracked on the question. "I am tired of fighting. I have built churches. I have funded missions. I have given decades of my life, and still the world grows louder, colder, greedier." He looked out over Gangnam, his face lined with grief. "I think God has forgotten this corner of the city." Christina turned toward him and stepped closer. Then she took his hands in hers. They were cold, dry, tired. "He hasn't forgotten," she said. Her voice was steady. "You have." Moon-soo looked at her, wounded and startled. "You are not just tired," she said. "You are burnt out. There's a difference. You've been running this place on order and efficiency for so long that you forgot what lit the fire in the first place." Moon-soo looked away. His jaw worked once before he finally whispered, "I am 80 years old." A tear slipped free and vanished into the wind. Christina squeezed his hands tighter. And Moses was 80 when his real assignment began. Her voice rose, strong and full of life. "You think this is the end of your chapter? No. The author is just sharpening his pencil." Moon-soo let out a broken breath. Then Christina lifted her chin and gave him a look that was half challenge, half invitation. "I challenge you, Elder Moon-soo," she said. "A prayer duel." He blinked. "A what?" "A prayer duel," she repeated. "We do not leave this roof until you hear something louder than Starkey. For the first time that night, the faintest shadow of disbelief crossed his face. But Christina was serious, and somehow he knew it. So they knelt, right there on the cold concrete. At first, there was only the wind, that and Moon-soo's rough breathing. Then Christina began to pray, not softly, not politely, not like a woman trying to sound respectable. She prayed like someone trying to pull fire back down into a dying place. Her voice rose into the dark, fierce, rhythmic, alive. Her New Zealand vowels blending with the raw ache of a spirit that had no intention of watching the center die quietly. Time passed. The city lights kept flickering around them. One by one, the signs on the surrounding towers went dark as the night wore on. Still she prayed. And then, just before dawn, in that strange, thin hour when the night feels deepest and morning still looks impossible, Moon-soo finally opened his mouth. At first, it was barely a sound, a whisper, a crack. Then came confession. He confessed his pride, his fear, his coldness, and his exhaustion. And then his prayer began to grow, stronger, deeper. He started naming the children one by one. Minho, Jisoo, Hana. Not as trainees, not as projects, not as responsibilities, but as sons and daughters of the king. By the time the first line of sunlight cut through the Seoul smog, Moon-soo was no longer kneeling like a defeated man. He rose like a prophet. Then, without saying a word, he reached into his coat, pulled out the Star-K documents, and tore them straight down the middle. Once, twice, again. White paper scattered into the wind like surrender in reverse. The city below kept moving. But on that rooftop, something had changed. Moon-soo was not done, and neither was Agape. The next morning, Moon-soo's office smelled like old paper, polished wood, and pure stubbornness. A concert? His tone was flat with disbelief. He paced in front of his heavy mahogany desk with his hands behind his back, every few steps sharp and controlled, like he was trying to walk off the absurdity of what he had just heard. Christina, we are trying to stop a demolition, not audition for a variety show. Star-K has billions. They have marketing machines, investors, media networks. He turned and gestured sharply. We have what? One broken piano and a group of children who are afraid of their own shadows. Christina stood in the doorway, completely unbothered. She was wearing a bright teal cardigan that practically glowed against the gray dullness of the office. We have the Holy Spirit, she said, and a story no one else in the city is telling. Moon-soo made a low sound in his throat that could have meant anything. But Christina kept going. A silver and gold gala, she said. The wisdom of the elders meeting the fire of the youth. We show Seoul that Agape is not some useless relic waiting to be buried. She smiled. It's a bridge. Moon-soo stopped pacing just long enough to stare at her. It is ridiculous, he said. I am a man of dignity. I do not perform. I oversee. Christina pushed herself off the doorframe and folded her arms. That is your problem, Moon-soo. He frowned. You have forgotten how to make a joyful noise, she said. You've got plenty of noise, plenty of order, plenty of management, but no joy. She stepped closer. If you are going to lead these children into battle, you need to remember why the song was written in the first place. Moon-soo opened his mouth to argue, but before he could, Christina grabbed her coat from the chair, picked up his umbrella, and headed for the door. Come on, she said. Moon-soo stared at her. Where are we going? Field trip. It is raining, Christina. Yes. I have spreadsheets. The spreadsheets can wait. He looked scandalized. Christina turned back, one hand already on the door. God did not call Moses to a desk, she said. He called him to a burning bush. Then she gave him a pointed look. Move your feet, Elder. 30 minutes later, Moon-soo found himself standing in the middle of a neon-soaked noraebang tucked into a side alley in Gangnam. And he looked exactly like what he was, a deeply offended church elder trapped in a karaoke room. The walls were padded with glittering vinyl. A disco ball turned lazily overhead, throwing broken light across his stunned face. In one hand, he still held an umbrella, like it might somehow protect him from the entire experience. A karaoke room, he hissed. Christina, this is a den of secular vanity. I am an elder of the church. Christina didn't even look ashamed. She was already punching numbers into the giant remote with the confidence of a woman led by both the spirit and stubbornness. Oh, hush, she said. King David danced until he looked foolish. If he could do it in a linen ephod, you can survive it in a three-piece suit. Before Moon-soo could object again, the speakers crackled. Then the music started. It was an old Korean trot song from the 1960s, the kind of song filled with longing, grit, and survival. The melody rose through the tiny room like something both aching and brave. Christina picked up the microphone, and then she sang, not politely, not cautiously, not like a 78-year-old woman trying to do her best. She sang like the room belonged to her. Her voice was rich and warm and soulful, carrying both the salt of New Zealand and the strength of 1,000 Sunday mornings. She didn't just hit the notes. She lived inside them. Neon pink and electric blue flashed across her silver hair as she moved with a grace that was joyful, loose, and completely unashamed. Moon-soo stared. Until that moment, he had seen Christina as many things: an inconvenience, a disruption, a challenge, then, slowly, a partner. But now, for the first time, he saw her as a woman, not fragile, not quaint, not someone to be managed. She was vibrant, magnetic, alive in a way that made the ridiculous little karaoke room feel less like a side street box and more like holy ground. She turned toward him, slightly breathless and grinning, and held out the second microphone. Your turn. Moon-soo blinked. I don't know the words. It was a lie, a terrible lie, and Christina knew it. The words are right there in neon. Moon-soo, she said. Don't let efficiency kill the praise. Sing. Something inside him shifted. Maybe it was the rooftop prayer. Maybe it was the music. Maybe it was the way Christina kept looking at him. Not like an old man running out of time, but like someone still full of purpose. Whatever it was, it broke through. Slowly, he took the microphone. His first notes came out low and rough, his baritone a little shaky at the edges. He started with an old hymn, one he had known for years, one rooted in memory and heritage. Then Christina found the harmony, and suddenly Moon-soo found his voice. It deepened, opened, filled out. The sound rose into the little room and wrapped around him, strong enough to make his own chest vibrate. He closed his eyes, and for one brief, startling moment, everything else disappeared. The debt, the pressure, Star K, the loneliness, the fear, all of it. Gone. He was 80 years old. He was still breathing. And he was singing. When the song ended, the screen flashed a giant 100 with digital fireworks exploding in every direction. Then silence. They stood there catching their breath, the air between them suddenly charged with something neither of them was ready to name out loud. Moon-soo looked at Christina. Her cheeks were flushed. Her eyes were shining. In the spinning disco light, she looked somehow both radiant and untouchable, like time had forgotten to claim her. Then, very quietly, he said, "You were right." Christina lifted a brow. "The concert," he said. "We'll do it." A beat passed. but only if you promise to sing that harmony. Christina smiled and reached out to straighten his lapel. Elder, she said softly, I've been waiting 40 years for someone to ask. And just like that, the Silver Rebellion stopped being an idea. It became a spark. And deep in the neon heart of Gangnam, the fire started spreading. The shift from the noise of Gangnam to the quiet streets of Samcheong-dong felt like stepping through a hidden door in time. One moment there was neon, traffic, and city heat. The next, there were curved tiled roofs, narrow alleys, damp earth, and the soft scent of wood smoke in the air. Moon-soo led Christina through a heavy wooden gate into a hanok tucked away from the world. Inside, the courtyard was still and beautiful, moss-covered stone, worn wood, and a single ancient persimmon tree standing like it had seen everything and rushed for nothing. Moon-soo gestured for Christina to sit on one of the silk floor cushions beside a low walnut table. I used to come here when I wanted to disappear, he said. His voice was quieter now, lower, more intimate. A woman in a charcoal hanbok brought them dechu cha, thick, sweet jujube tea that tasted warm and soft, almost like comfort made drinkable. For a while, neither of them said much. There was only the gentle clink of ceramic spoons and the faint chime of a wind bell somewhere in the courtyard. Then Christina looked at him carefully. You look different here, she said. Moon-soo glanced up. Different how? She held his gaze. Less like a general, she said. More like a man. For a moment he said nothing. Then he looked down into his tea. His reflection trembled in the dark surface. I was a general for 40 years, he said, but not for God. His voice tightened slightly. For myself. He let out a slow breath. I built an empire of music, contracts, influence, buildings, prestige. Then he shook his head once, but I built it with a heart of stone. Christina stayed quiet, so he kept going. My wife, he said, and the words seemed to cost him something. She was like you. She had music in her step, warmth, light. But I was always looking at the next contract, the next tower, the next version of success. I thought if I gave her a beautiful house, then I had done my job. He swallowed. I mistook provision for presence. The courtyard felt even quieter after that. By the time I realized it, he said, the Lord had already called her home. I never told her I was proud of her. I never even sang with her. The confession sat between them, raw and unguarded. Then he looked up at Christina. I told myself agape was penance, he said, a way to repay something I can never repay. That is why I am rigid, why I cling to control. If I loosen my grip, I'm afraid I will have to face everything I failed to be. For a second, Christina simply looked at him. Then she reached across the table. Her hand covered his. Warm, steady, gentle. Moon-soo stiffened at first, but she didn't pull away. She waited, and after a moment, his hand slowly turned under hers until his palm met hers fully. Moon-soo, she said softly, grace is not a wage. He looked at her. You do not earn it by becoming a perfect elder. You receive it because you are a broken child who still needs God. Her thumb brushed across his knuckles. When Henry died, I thought my music died too, she said. I went back to a quiet house and a quieter life. I thought God had put me on a shelf, like I had become a discarded instrument. Moon-soo listened without interrupting. But after a while, she said, I realized the silence was not the end of the song. She smiled faintly. It was just the rest between the notes. Something in Moon-soo's expression shifted. Christina squeezed his hand. God did not send me here to fix those children, she said, and he did not send me here to fix you. He sent me here so we could remind each other that the composer is not finished yet. Moon-soo did not look away. He couldn't, because in that moment, she was no longer just the bold woman from New Zealand with a thermos and a sharp tongue. She was someone who had survived her own fire and come through with the music still in her bones. He drew in a slow breath. "I have spent 80 years waiting for a sign," he said quietly. "I thought it would be dramatic, a burning bush, a voice from heaven, something unmistakable." His eyes stayed on hers. "I did not think it would be a woman with a silver bun and honey tea." Christina laughed softly, but the sound caught in her chest, because there it was again. That strange, impossible flutter she had not felt in decades. Not foolishness, not fantasy. Recognition. Deep calling unto deep. When they finally stood to leave, Moon-soo did not walk ahead of her like he usually did. He walked beside her. Their arms brushed once, then again. Neither of them moved away, and for the first time, they no longer felt like two elderly people racing against the clock. They felt like two souls discovering that sometimes the best part of the song is not the beginning. It is the encore. The rain over Seoul had turned sharp. It hit the windows of the Agape Youth Center in thin, needling lines, hissing against the glass like the storm had something personal to say. But inside the building, it somehow felt even colder. Christina sat alone in the communal kitchen, the blue glow of her laptop painting her face in tired light. The Silver Rebellion concert was trending across Korean social media, just not for the reasons they had prayed for. Post after post flashed across the screen. Anonymous industry insiders were accusing the center of exploiting vulnerable trainees. Others claimed an unqualified foreign amateur was endangering young people with what they called unlicensed therapy disguised as ministry. Christina stared at the words until they began to blur. Then, in a voice far smaller than usual, she said, "They're calling me a fraud, Moon-soo." She swallowed hard. "They're saying I'm a delusional tourist playing with children's lives." Moon-soo stood nearby, silent for a moment, as if he were trying to measure the exact weight of that sentence. But before he could answer, the heavy oak doors at the front of the center opened with a low groan. A courier stepped inside. Black uniform, sharp shoes, expressionless face. He crossed the room without hesitation and handed Moon-soo a thick cream-colored envelope stamped with the Star K logo. Moon-soo opened it, and all the color left his face. He read it once, then again. Finally, he slid the letter across the table toward Christina. "It's worse than a bribe," he said quietly. She looked down and scanned the page. Star K was offering him a legacy appointment. A new performing arts wing in their upcoming mall development would be named after his late wife. He would be given a seat on the board, a pension, prestige, security, every debt erased. All he had to do was terminate Christina's volunteer contract for safety reasons and vacate the building by Friday. The silence that followed was suffocating. Christina looked at the letter, then at Moon-soo, then back at the letter again, because she understood exactly what it was. Not just money, not just status. It was the entire old life he had spent decades chasing, laid out neatly and handed back to him on a silver platter. Then her phone buzzed. A video call from New Zealand. She answered. Sarah and David filled the screen immediately, both of them wide-eyed and frantic. "Mom, we saw the news," Sarah said before Christina could speak. "There are protesters outside that center. People online are calling it a cult." David leaned closer to the camera. "You have to come home, please. We already booked your flight for tomorrow. Just come back, Mom. Come back where people know you. Come back to your garden. Come back somewhere safe." Christina looked at their faces, then at the comments still flashing across her laptop, then at Moon-soo, who stood there like stone, letter still in hand. And for the first time in a long time, the fire inside her flickered. Just for a moment. Maybe they were right. Maybe she had gone too far. Maybe she was just an old woman with a passport and a calling no one else could see. Maybe this really was the place where the story should end. Her hand drifted toward her handbag. Maybe, she said softly. Her voice trembled. Maybe I've overstayed my welcome, Moon-soo. If me being here is hurting the children, if it's hurting the center, if it's hurting your reputation. Her fingers touched the leather strap. That was when Moon-soo spoke. Sit down, Christina. His voice didn't just interrupt her. It filled the room. This was not the rigid elder from the day she arrived. This was the man who had found his song again. Without looking at the offer one more time, he picked up the star K letter, walked to the shredder beside the desk, and fed it in with slow, deliberate calm. The machine growled to life. Paper disappeared. Prestige disappeared. Legacy disappeared. The sound of that offer being shredded into strips was the only thing anyone heard for several seconds. Then Moon-soo turned and walked straight toward Christina's phone. He looked directly into the camera. Sarah, David, he said. His English was formal, clear, unshaken. Your mother told me something on the day she arrived. He paused. She told me Moses was 80 when he faced Pharaoh. She told me that as long as there is breath, the chapter is not closed. Then he turned from the screen and looked at Christina. And the look in his eyes was no longer guarded. It was fierce, protective, certain. You reminded me that God does not call the qualified, he said. He qualifies the called. He took another step toward her. Star K is just Pharaoh in a better suit. And these rumors? He shook his head. That is the sound of the enemy screaming, because he knows he is losing. Then he reached for her hand, the same hand he had held in the tea house, the same hand that had pulled him back toward purpose. He wrapped his fingers around it and held on. You are not a liability, Christina Adams, he said. You are the grace note this city was missing. Her breath caught. If you leave now, you are not going to safety, he said. You are going to a waiting room. Then his voice deepened. And we still have a Red Sea to cross. Christina looked at him. Really looked at him. The man who had once tried to send her away for the sake of efficiency was now standing in front of her like a wall of protection. And just like that, the fear inside her began to unwind. Not because the headlines had changed, not because the danger was gone, but because she suddenly remembered exactly why she had come. She turned back to the screen. Sarah and David were staring in stunned silence. Christina lifted her chin. Cancel the ticket, she said. Sarah blinked. Mom? I'm not done yet, Christina said. I haven't even reached the bridge of the song. Then she ended the call. A single tear slipped down her face, but this time it was not fear. It was relief. She looked up at Moon-soo and let out a shaky laugh. You used my own Moses logic against me, Elder, she said. That's low. And for the first time in a long while, Moon-soo smiled without restraint. The lines around his eyes softened. Efficiency, Christina, he said. It was the most effective way to keep you here. Outside, the rain kept falling, but inside Agape, the fire was no longer a flicker. Now it was a furnace. The storm that had been building in the headlines finally broke. Just not the way Star K expected. It broke inside Minho. It happened at 2 a.m. Christina was asleep in her small on-site apartment when she was jolted awake by the sound of piano keys being struck again and again and again. Not music, not practice, something rawer, desperate. It sounded like panic with a melody underneath it. She threw on her robe and ran. By the time she reached Studio 4, her heart was already pounding. Inside, the room was nearly dark. The only light came from the cold blue pulse of a metronome. And Minho was at the piano, bent over the keys, breathing in broken gasps. His fingers were moving so violently that the skin had split in places. Blood marked the keys. His eyes were wide, unfocused, trapped somewhere between memory and terror. He wasn't practicing. He was reliving something. Min-ho. Christina's voice cut through the room, sharp and commanding. Stop! The tone that came out of her was not the gentle mentor's voice. It was Nurse Adams, the voice she had used in hospital wards, emergency rooms, and the long, hard nights when fear had to be met with authority. But Min-ho didn't hear her. He kept pounding at the keys, hyperventilating, his chest tightening harder and harder as the panic took over. Then the door burst open behind her. Moon-soo rushed in wearing silk pajamas and no dignity at all, which, under normal circumstances, would have been almost funny. But not now. One look at Min-ho's blue-tinged lips and he froze. He's, Moon-soo whispered, horror rising in his throat. He's dying, Christina. Christina was already moving. No, she snapped. He's not dying. He's drowning. She dropped to her knees beside the bench and grabbed Min-ho's shaking hands. Min-ho, look at me. His eyes flickered but didn't fully focus. Look at me. This time he did. That was all she needed. In for 4, she said firmly. Hold for 4. Out for 4. Again. In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. She kept her voice low and steady, forcing her calm to become something he could cling to. And slowly, painfully, inch by inch, he began to follow her back toward his own breath. For the next 6 hours, the Agape Youth Center stopped being a school, a sanctuary, or a battleground. It became a place of triage, a place of care, a place where someone's soul was being held together one fragile thread at a time. Christina moved through it all with the seamless instinct of a woman who had done this for decades. She cleaned the cuts on Min-ho's fingers, checked his pulse, wrapped him in the heavy wool blanket from her own bed, kept water nearby, watched his breathing, lowered the lights, spoke only when needed. By dawn, the worst of the physical panic had passed, but the deeper wound was still open. Min-ho sat curled in on himself, trembling under the blanket. Then, without warning, he broke, not loudly, not dramatically, just a silent, shuddering collapse of grief. Years of pressure, years of rejection, years of being told he was useful only if he performed. It all came pouring out at once. I can't do the concert, he choked out. His face was buried in his knees. I can't. I'm broken. Another breath, another shudder. I'm just a shadow. Christina looked up. Moon-soo was standing by the window, helpless in a way that clearly frightened him. She didn't say a word. She simply pointed to the chair on the other side of Min-ho. Moon-soo hesitated. Then slowly he crossed the room and sat down. He didn't know how to nurse. He knew that. But he did know how to pray. So he reached out and rested one weathered hand on Min-ho's shoulder. And when he spoke, his voice was nothing like the bark of command the boy had known before. It was low, steady, full. He began to pray over him like a father covering a son. He spoke of the shepherd who leaves the 99 for the one. He spoke of the bruised reed that God does not break. He spoke of mercy, of belonging, of a name that could not be canceled by an industry or erased by failure. And in that quiet room, as rain faded and morning slowly began to gather at the window, Min-ho sat between them, one on each side, held up by grace, breath, and 2 people who refused to let him disappear. By the time morning began pushing through the smog over Gangnam, the sky had turned a soft, dusty violet. Christina and Moon-soo were still sitting on the studio floor, one on each side of Min-ho, like 2 old pillars refusing to let him fall. They had taken turns all night. Christina had given him water, warmth, and the steady physical comfort of someone who knew how to hold a body through panic. Moon-soo had given him prayer, scripture, and the kind of spiritual covering that sounded less like performance and more like fatherhood. And by 7 o'clock, Minho had finally fallen asleep on the studio sofa. Not the restless kind of sleep, not the light guarded kind, the deep kind, the kind that only comes when your body finally believes it is safe. Christina leaned her head back against the cold brick wall and closed her eyes for a moment. Exhaustion burned behind them. Her silver hair had come loose from its bun and now fell around her face in soft waves, catching what little morning light had reached the room. Moon-soo looked at her, really looked at her. The adrenaline was gone now. The crisis had passed, and in the quiet that followed, there was no room left for distance or pretense, just truth. After a long silence, Moon-soo spoke. I spent 40 years believing the music business was about perfect performance, he said quietly. I thought if the notes were correct, then everything underneath must be fine. His voice thickened. But tonight, he shook his head. Tonight I saw what real labor looks like. Christina turned toward him, tired but smiling. You did not just save his breath, Moon-soo said. You fought for his life. That made her smile a little wider. I told you, Moon-soo, she said softly. I'm just hitting my stride. Something in him broke open at that. He reached out slowly, almost like he was asking permission without words, and brushed a loose strand of silver hair away from her face. The touch was gentle, but it landed like fire. Suddenly, the cold room didn't feel cold at all. Moon-soo's eyes held hers, dark and unguarded now. When I look at you, he said, I see the burning bush. Christina didn't move. I see a fire that does not consume, he said. It warms. It calls. It makes everything clearer. His voice dropped even lower. I have not felt this alive, or this needed in 30 years. He swallowed. I thought my life had become a museum. Quiet. Preserved. Finished. Then he gave a faint, almost disbelieving shake of his head. You turned it back into a workshop. Christina didn't pull away. Instead, she reached for his hand. Their fingers interlocked there in the gray quiet of dawn, and the look she gave him held both tenderness and certainty. That's a good thing, Elder, she said, her voice soft, because the workshop is about to get very busy. And there they stayed. In the hush after a long night, two people sitting in the aftermath of rescue, both realizing that some of the most beautiful harmonies are not written in daylight. They are born in the dark when nobody leaves. Later, high above the city on Namsan Mountain, the air felt crisp enough to taste. It carried the scent of dry leaves, early winter, and the last warmth of autumn holding on. Below them, Seoul stretched wide and glowing, a sea of amber, gold, and glass. The late afternoon sun hit the towers of Gangnam until they looked less like buildings and more like pillars of fire. Moon-soo walked beside Christina at an easy pace, not the stiff, efficient stride she had first known, not the brisk march of a man forever late for his own life. This was different. This was the walk of someone no longer in a hurry to reach the end of things. He wore a soft cashmere overcoat instead of his usual severe suit, and for once, he wasn't checking his silver watch every few minutes, as though time needed managing. Christina pulled her wrap a little tighter as the wind caught in her silver hair. In New Zealand, she said, the seasons change gently, quietly, like they're trying not to disturb anyone. She looked around at the trees blazing all around them. But here, she smiled, here it feels like the trees are making one final glorious protest before the snow. Moon-soo looked at her. A protest, he repeated softly. They stopped beneath a wide maple tree, its leaves so dark and red they looked like spilled wine against the fading light. He turned fully toward her. That is what we are doing, isn't it? he asked, protesting the idea that our time is over. Christina leaned lightly against the railing and smiled. No, she said. We're testifying. That answer lingered between them. Moon-soo rested one hand on the railing near hers and looked out at the cable cars slowly climbing the mountain. For a moment, he said nothing. Then the weight in him shifted. Christina, he said quietly, when you first arrived with your suitcases and that no-worry spirit of yours, I thought you were a storm I simply had to survive. She laughed softly under her breath, but Moon-soo didn't smile. Not because he was cold, because what he was saying mattered too much. I thought my life was a closed book, he said. Organized, labeled, shelved, finished. He turned toward her. I told myself I was at peace. I called it faith. Then his voice roughened. But it was not faith. A pause. It was exhaustion. Christina's breath caught. Moon-soo stepped closer until the distance between them was no longer practical, only personal. The fading light caught in his eyes, and for the first time there was no weariness left in them, only wakefulness, only truth. But then you came, he said, and you became my burning bush. Christina's heart began to pound so hard, it almost embarrassed her. He kept going. I looked at you and saw a fire that did not destroy, he said. It clarified. It woke me up. It showed me that God was not done with me because I was 80. His voice dropped. He was just beginning, because for the first time in my life, I was finally empty enough for him to fill. Christina opened her mouth, but only his name came out. Moon-soo. The board keeps asking about the renewal of your 12-month contract, he said, cutting in gently, but with an urgency that told her he had carried these words for a while. My children keep asking when you are leaving. His eyes did not leave hers, and he exhaled slowly. I cannot imagine the music without the grace note. That landed deep. His hand rose, trembling just slightly, and he cupped her face. His palm was warm and weathered. The touch held all the years he had lived, and all the tenderness he had denied himself. I do not want the contract to end, Christina, he whispered, and I do not want us to end. Tears rose in her eyes instantly. Moon-soo's voice dropped to almost nothing. I am an old man, he said, who has spent too long in winter. He leaned closer. Will you stay? A pause. Not for the center, not for the mission. Then, with all the vulnerability of a man laying down the last of his pride, for me. Christina looked up at him, tears shining in her eyes, and suddenly none of the years seemed to matter. Not Auckland, not Seoul, not age, not titles, not history. Just this. Two souls who had found each other in the dark and recognized home. She leaned into his hand. I've spent most of my life being sensible, Moon-soo, she whispered. My children want me in a villa with a heated pool. A small, trembling smile touched her mouth. But I think God has a mountain for me to climb instead. Moon-soo rested his forehead gently against hers. Then let us climb it together. And then he kissed her. Not like youth, not hurried, not reckless. This was something deeper, something slower, a kiss full of patience, reverence, and the ache of two lives that had known loss well enough to recognize the holy when it arrived. It felt less like the beginning of a romance and more like the sealing of a covenant. Around them, the red maple leaves lifted in the wind and spun through the air like confetti. When they finally pulled apart, they were both smiling, and Moon-soo still didn't let her go. He tucked her arms securely into his, like a man who had finally found what he was no longer willing to lose. Together, they turned and looked out over the city below. The sun was sinking, but for Christina Adams and Elder Moon-soo, life was not winding down. It was opening up. The day looked like it was ending, But for them, it had only just begun. By the time the night of the concert arrived, the makeshift auditorium inside the Agape Youth Center felt like it was holding its breath. The air was thick with floor wax, perfume, nerves, and hope. Not polished hope, not easy hope. The desperate kind. The kind carried by people who have already been overlooked too many times and know this may be their last chance to be seen. Outside, Gangnam kept glowing like nothing sacred was at stake. Neon signs flashed, traffic moved, money kept breathing. And in the front row, the Star K executives sat stiff and unimpressed, their arms crossed, their tablets glowing in their hands. They had not come to be changed. They had come to watch Agape fail in public. In their minds, this was the end. A sloppy little final performance from a dying building. Backstage, Christina stood in the middle of a circle of trembling teenagers. She looked radiant in a deep plum silk gown, her silver hair lifted around her face like a crown made of light. Beside her stood Moon-soo, one hand resting firmly on Minho's shoulder. No one was talking, not really, just breathing too fast, swallowing too hard, trying not to fall apart before the first note. Then Christina spoke. "Listen to the silence," she said softly. Every eye turned to her. The silence before the music. Her voice was low and steady, wrapping around the room like a hand at the center of someone's back. "It is not empty," she said. "That is where God is waiting." The teenagers stilled. "You are not singing for the men in that front row," she continued. "You are not performing for approval. You are singing for the one who gave you your breath." She looked around the circle, making sure every one of them heard her. "Moses did not dance for Pharaoh," she said. "He moved for the freedom that called him." Then Moon-soo stepped forward. His eyes settled on Minho, not on the group, not on the room, on Minho. "You are not surplus, son," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried. "You are the melody this city forgot." A pause. "Lead them." The lights dimmed. The room fell into darkness. Then a single spotlight came down and found Minho at the grand piano. For one brief second, everything held still. Then he began, not with a K-pop intro, not with something flashy, not with the kind of beat Star K would have expected. He started with Chopin, a nocturne, haunting, delicate, precise. It was the kind of classical perfection Moon-soo would once have demanded from the first note to the last. But this time, it was only the beginning. Because as the melody stretched into the air, something shifted beneath it. A cello joined in, played by the girl who had once been told she was too plain for the camera. Then came the low pulse of a synthesizer underneath the piano line. Steady, modern, alive, old world, new fire. Grace meeting grit. Structure meeting spirit. It should not have worked, but it did. When the vocals came in, the room changed. It didn't just sound fuller. It felt bigger. The shadow trainees moved onto the stage, and they did not move like a polished idol group trained to be machine perfect. There was no glossy emptiness in it, no robotic charm, no manufactured precision. What they had was something far more dangerous: life. They moved with raw grace, with hunger, with freedom. And when they sang, they did not sing about shallow love or glittering dreams. They sang about dry bones rising. They sang about forgotten people finding breath again. They sang about the grace of God that changes everything after it. From the wings, Christina watched with one hand over her mouth. Without looking, she reached to the side and found Moon-soo's hand in the dark. His fingers closed around hers instantly. His pulse was strong, steady, joyful. In the front row, the lead Star K executive finally stopped looking at his tablet. Then he leaned forward, not because he wanted to, because he had to. He was being pulled towards something he could not manufacture, buy, package, or control. Then, all across the back of the room, phones started rising into the air. Not from the executives, from the crowd, from the young people packed shoulder to shoulder near the back wall, from those spilling out into the hallway, from those standing outside the doors. They were not just watching anymore. They were streaming, recording, sending it out into the world in real time. And by the time the performance reached its final movement, that soaring, impossible blend of Mari chant and modern Korean anthem, the room was no longer the only audience. The video had broken loose. It was moving too fast to contain. This was no longer just a concert. It was a wildfire. And within minutes, the agape movement was trending far beyond Seoul. Then came the final note. It rose, held, opened, and landed. After that, there was silence. 5 long seconds of it. The kind of silence that tells you something sacred just happened, and nobody wants to be the first one to break it. Then the whole room erupted. Not polite applause, not cultured appreciation. A roar. The sound of people recognizing truth when they heard it. Moon-soo stepped onto the stage. Not like a businessman, not like a mogul, not even like an elder trying to manage optics. He stepped up like a father. He looked at the Star K executives, then at the crowd, then, finally, at Christina. And when he spoke into the microphone, he didn't use the prepared speech in his pocket. He used his own voice. "This building is made of brick and mortar," he said. His words rolled through the auditorium like thunder. "But the temple is made of these children." The crowd got louder. Moon-soo lifted his chin. "You cannot demolish a movement," he said. "You cannot evict the Holy Spirit." Then his voice rose. "Agape stays." The room nearly came apart. The Star K executives stood, but not with the confidence they arrived with. They looked down at their screens. The numbers were climbing too fast. Millions of views. Shares exploding by the second. They had come expecting relics. Instead, they had been outplayed by revival. Christina stepped onto the stage and joined them. She stood between Moon-soo and Minho, the old and the new, the wounded and the restored, the prayer and the answer. For a moment, she looked up toward the rafters, and in that instant it felt to her as though heaven had leaned close enough to listen, as though the Red Sea had split again, as though Jericho had remembered what happens when the right sound hits the right walls. She stood there in the middle of a foreign city, at 78 years old, with thousands roaring around her, and she had never felt more at home. Then she smiled and whispered, almost to herself, "God's not done yet." Her eyes lifted to the crowd. "We're just getting to the chorus." By the time the cherry blossoms began drifting through the courtyard like pale pink snow, Christina's visa had reached its final day. 12 months. A full year. What had started as a mission now hung in the air like the last note of a song no one was ready to let go of. Christina sat in the communal garden with her suitcases packed and lined up by the door. They stood there quietly, like soldiers waiting for orders. Across from her sat Sarah, who had flown in from Auckland 2 days earlier with a face full of concern and a plan already prepared. "Mom," Sarah said, looking at her with a tired kind of love, "just look at everything you've done." She gave a small, helpless laugh. "You saved the center. You became a viral sensation. You proved everyone wrong." Then her tone softened. "But it's over now." Christina said nothing. Sarah leaned forward. "The adventure is finished," she said. "Your room at the Palms is ready. The grandkids are counting the days until you're back. Sunday roast is waiting. Home is waiting." Christina's eyes drifted toward the suitcases. They represented safety, comfort, routine, a slower life, a neat life. The kind of life people expected a 79-year-old woman to choose without hesitation. A life of gardens, puzzles, afternoon tea, and days so predictable they barely left a footprint. The life she was supposed to want. Then the door to the main hall creaked open. Moon-soo stepped into the courtyard. He looked immaculate, as always, in a navy suit, but his face gave him away. His eyes looked worn, quiet, almost hollow, like he had spent the last 2 days arguing with himself in silence and losing every round. Sarah stood politely. "Elder Moon-soo," she said with a stiff nod. "Thank you for looking after her. We're leaving for Incheon in 3 hours." Moon-soo barely looked at her. His eyes went straight to Christina, and in that one look lived everything. The karaoke room, the rooftop prayer, the concert, the mountain, the kiss under the maples. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden key. Traditional, smooth, beautifully carved. Then he set it gently on the stone table between them. "The car is waiting," he said. His voice came out rough, low, scraped thin by restraint. Christina looked at the key. It was for the newly renovated music wing. Moon-soo kept his eyes on her. "I have no right to ask a mother to stay away from her children," he said. "God gave Moses a mountain, but he also gave him a people." His hand hovered near the key for a second, then fell away. "Your people are in New Zealand, Christina." He swallowed. "Go with peace." Another pause. "The music you started here will not stop. I will make sure the grace note remains." The words landed like a blade wrapped in velvet. Christina felt it physically. That sharp ache in the chest that comes when your soul is being pulled in opposite directions. She looked at Sarah, her daughter, her history, her blood. Then she looked at Moon-soo, her calling, her future, her late-in-life rebellion against everything the world had told her aging was supposed to mean. Then she asked the one question that mattered. "Is that what you want, Moon-soo?" Her voice was calm. "For me to go?" Moon-soo closed his eyes for a moment. Just a moment. But it was enough for the grief to show. When he opened them again, his jaw was tight. "I want you to be happy," he said. "I want you to be safe." His voice dropped lower. "I am 81 years old, Christina. I'm a man of the sunset. I can't give you the kind of safety your daughter is offering." For a few seconds, no one moved. Then Christina stood. She walked slowly to the suitcases and let her fingers brush the worn leather. She thought about the palms, the polished comfort, the 24-hour nursing, the soft, managed ending people kept trying to hand her like it was a reward. And suddenly she saw it for what it really was. Not peace, not rest, just a slower kind of disappearance, a comfortable fading, a tidy exit from a life that still had fire in it. Then she turned and looked at the youth center. She heard laughter from the second floor. Minho's laughter. She felt the pulse of the city around her, the movement, the need, the life that was still unfolding. And deeper than all of that, she felt the hand of the God who had called an 80-year-old shepherd to split a sea. "Safety," Christina said softly. Then she looked at Sarah. "Darling, you think safety is a place where nothing happens." Sarah's face tightened. "You think my age is a cage," Christina said, "but these last 12 months have taught me something." She walked back to the table. Then she picked up the wooden key. "Moses did not go back to the sheep after he saw the promised land," she said. "He stayed with the calling." Her eyes flashed. "He stayed with the fire." Sarah stared at her in disbelief. "Mom, you cannot be serious." Her voice rose. "You're staying here, in this chaos?" Christina's face softened. She stepped closer and cupped her daughter's face with both hands. "It's not chaos, darling," she said gently. "It's a new symphony." A small smile touched her mouth. "And I've just realized something." Sarah blinked through tears. "I'm the lead soloist." Then Christina turned toward Moon-soo. He was staring at her like hope itself had become too big for his chest. And with that same bright, mischievous light in her eyes, she said, "Elder Moon-soo, you told me you could not offer me safety." She smiled wider. "Good." Moon-soo's breath caught. "I've had 79 years of safety," she said, "and quite frankly, it bored me to tears." Then she lifted the key slightly. "I'd rather have the mountain." That was all Moon-soo needed. He crossed the courtyard in 3 quick strides, abandoned every last ounce of dignity and caution, and pulled her straight into his arms. His white hair brushed against her silver. His hold was tight, certain, trembling. And when he spoke, his voice was thick with tears. "The contract is void," he whispered against her ear. "From now on, it's a lifetime appointment." Sarah stood frozen beside the suitcases, too stunned to speak, because what she was watching made no sense according to the world's timeline. 2 octogenarians, in the middle of Gangnam, holding each other like youth had nothing on them. But that was the truth of it. Christina Adams was not refusing to go home. She had already found it. The final night of the year in Seoul arrived dressed in frost and fire. Above Gangnam, the sky stretched wide in deep velvet blue, waiting for midnight to break it open with gold and crimson fireworks. Inside the Agape Youth Center, everything felt different from the silence Christina had first walked into a year earlier. The air was warm and alive. It smelled like roasted chestnuts, bulgogi, celebration, and the unmistakable electricity of a dream that had actually come true. The grand ballroom was full. International donors had come. City officials had come. Former shadow trainees had come too. Not bowed down this time, not hollow-eyed, not broken. They came dressed with dignity, standing tall, walking like people who had finally remembered their own names. And in the guest of honors booth sat Sarah, David, and Christina's oldest grandson, Leo. They had not come to take her home. They had come to witness the miracle she had refused to leave behind. As Minho stepped onto the stage to a standing ovation, Sarah stared in disbelief. His fingers moved across the piano with confidence now. Not fear, not pressure, not performance for survival. Joy, pure joy. Sarah leaned closer to her mother and whispered, "Mom, I thought you were losing your mind." Christina glanced at her with a small smile. "But I see it now," Sarah said, her voice cracking. "You didn't come here to retire." She looked out at the room, then back at Christina. "You came here to resurrect." Christina, dressed in a shimmering silver gown that caught the light every time she moved, reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand. A spark lit her eyes. "I didn't just resurrect the center, Sarah," she said quietly. She smiled. "I resurrected myself." Then the music swelled. It rose through the ballroom in layers, orchestral, rich, and full of memory. Hymns Christina had once hummed in her Auckland sunroom now moved through the room with the heartbeat of soul woven into them. And when the final note drifted into the rafters, Moon-soo stepped onto the stage. He looked different, lighter, younger somehow, though he was 81. The rigid, charcoal-suited monument Christina had first met was gone. In his place stood a man marked by peace instead of pressure. He adjusted the microphone. Then he looked out into the crowd until his eyes found Christina. "A year ago," he began, his voice steady and full, "I believed sunset meant the door should close." The room grew still. "I believed efficiency was the measure of a life." A pause. "I was wrong." Then he lifted one hand toward Christina. An invitation. And as she rose and began walking toward the stage, the crowd opened for her like the sea itself had remembered how. When she reached him, Moon-soo took her hand in front of everyone. No hesitation, no hiding. His fingers interlaced with hers, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Christina Adams came to us as a volunteer, he said. Then his voice softened. But she became our conductor. A murmur moved through the audience. She taught us that the music does not stop because the sun is setting, he said. That is when the encore begins. Then he turned fully toward her. The cameras were rolling. The city's eyes were on him. The dignitaries were watching. He ignored all of them. From his pocket, he drew out a small velvet box and opened it. Inside was not a diamond. It was something far more personal. A polished piece of New Zealand greenstone, set beautifully in Korean gold. A joining of worlds. A joining of stories. A joining of them. Christina, he said. And even through the microphone, his voice carried the trembling honesty of a man speaking straight from the center of himself. I do not want a 12-month contract. A beat. I want a covenant. The room went silent. I want a partnership, he said, in this center, in our faith, and in whatever years God still has for us. Then he looked directly into her eyes. Will you stay by my side for the encore? There was absolute silence. Christina looked at her family first. Sarah was crying openly now. David was nodding with that expression men wear when they are trying not to cry in public and failing anyway. Leo had his phone up, grinning like he already knew nobody back home was going to believe this, unless he had proof. Then Christina looked back at Moon-soo, her partner, her burning bush, her late life miracle in a city she never should have belonged to and somehow now fully did. And with joy clear in her voice, she said, I've already unpacked my bags, Moon-soo. A smile spread slowly across her face. The answer is yes. The ballroom exploded. The roar that followed was so loud it felt like it might challenge the fireworks waiting outside. An hour later, when the clock struck midnight and the new year burst over Seoul in fire and thunder, Christina and Moon-soo stood on the rooftop where they had once held their prayer duel. The skyline glowed in every direction. Neon blurred into starlight. Glass towers flashed beneath the sky. And the cold wind that wrapped around them didn't feel harsh. It felt clean, fresh, like a blessing. Moon-soo took off his coat and wrapped it around Christina's shoulders, drawing her close. Then he looked out over the city they had fought for, prayed over, and somehow helped awaken. We are officially octogenarians, Christina. She laughed softly. Moon-soo smiled. What do you think God has planned for the next decade? Christina rested her head against his shoulder and looked out at the fireworks painting the night. She thought of Moses. She thought of the Red Sea. She thought of songs still unsung and doors still unopened. Then she smiled. I don't know the melody yet, she said. Her eyes shone in the firelit dark. But I know the composer. A pause, and I think he's just getting to the best part. And there they stood, on the edge of their 80s, not like people waiting for life to wind down, but like warriors waiting for dawn. The symphony was nowhere near over. 5 years later, that truth had only grown louder. The Agape Moon Center no longer looked like a fragile brick building tucked between giants. Now it stood as a beautiful glass and timber sanctuary in the heart of Gangnam. Warm, open, alive. It was the only building in the district that kept its doors open 24 hours a day for prayer, music, and tea. And on a bright spring morning, with blossoms drifting through the courtyard, Christina Adams Moon sat smiling in the middle of it all. She was 84 now, still elegant, still sharp, still carrying the same fire. She wore a hanbok made from New Zealand merino wool, a perfect fusion of where she had come from and where God had planted her. Beside her sat Moon-soo, now 86 and remarkably lively, showing a little boy how to hold a violin bow properly. The boy was 4, and he was Minho's son. Minho, once the exhausted trainee who had forgotten how to breathe, was now the founder and CEO of Grace Note Records, the first major label in Seoul built around mental health, dignity, and spiritual grounding instead of ruthless profit. He had just come back from a world tour, not as a product, not as an idol shaped by industry, but as a singer-songwriter whose songs about redemption were topping charts from London to Tokyo. Moon-soo looked over at the little boy and let out a low chuckle. "He has your stubbornness, Christina," he said. Christina lifted a brow. Moon-soo nodded toward the child, who was frowning seriously at the violin. He refuses to play the scales until he feels the spirit of the string. Christina laughed, bright, warm, and full of the same salt air joy she had carried from New Zealand. "Good," she said. Then she looked out across the courtyard, where music, prayer, and life were still unfolding around her. "The world has enough metronomes," she said. A smile touched her lips. "It needs more heartbeats." A sleek black car pulled up to the curb, and this time, when Sarah and David stepped out, they were not wearing worry on their faces. They were carrying belonging. Sarah came first, balancing a tray of fresh lamingtons she had baked herself for the afternoon gala. David followed in an Agape Youth t-shirt, looking less like a concerned son and more like a man who had fully joined the work. They had not just accepted Christina's life and soul, they had become part of the mission. Every few months now, they flew in not to rescue her, but to serve beside her, volunteering at the clinic, helping with outreach, and watching with their own eyes what happens when a calling is obeyed instead of delayed. Then Leo came running over, phone in hand, grinning from ear to ear. "Grandma, look!" Christina turned toward him as he held up the screen. A video was playing from Times Square in New York. Hundreds of teenagers had gathered in the middle of the city, singing the anthem Christina and Moon-soo had introduced 5 years earlier. Not in a church, not on a stage, right there in the open. Young voices rising between the billboards and the traffic, carrying the same message all the way across the ocean. Christina looked at the video. Then she looked at the center behind her. Busy, alive, full of music and movement. Then she looked at Moon-soo, and right on time, his hand found hers. Their wedding bands, the greenstone and the gold, caught the light as if even the sun wanted in on the testimony. Moon-soo leaned in slightly, his voice low and warm. "You know," he said, "the board has an idea." Christina lifted a brow. "That usually means trouble," she said. Moon-soo smiled. "They think we should open a branch in Auckland." That stopped her. "In Auckland?" He nodded. "They say there are shepherdless youths in your home country who need to hear the melody too." For one heartbeat, Christina just stared at him. Then her eyes began to shine. "Auckland?" she repeated. "At our age? Crossing the ocean again?" Moon-soo straightened his vest with the same quiet dignity he had always carried. Only now there was joy in it too. Then he looked toward the horizon, and the fire in his eyes looked exactly like it had on that rooftop years before. "Why not?" he said. "Moses walked through the wilderness for 40 years. He glanced back at her. "We've only been doing this for 5. A faint smile touched his mouth. "We're practically youngsters." Christina laughed. Then she stood up slowly, smoothing the front of her gown. And as she stood there in the center of everything God had built from one yes, she felt it again. The strength in her legs, the clarity in her spirit, the unmistakable nearness of the one who had called her out of a quiet sunroom and into holy fire. She tucked her arm into Moon-soo's and smiled up at him. "Well then, Elder," she said, "pack the honey tea." Her eyes sparkled. "I believe God is about to start a new movement." Together, they turned and began walking toward the hall to lead the morning prayer. And just then, the bells of the center began to ring. Their sound rolled out across Gangnam, clear, steady, impossible to ignore, bouncing through the streets and between the towers like a reminder from heaven itself. As long as there is breath, there is still a calling. The sun was high, the music was loud, and for Christina and Moon-soo, the encore had only just begun. They will still bear fruit in old age. They will stay fresh and green, proclaiming, "The Lord is upright. He is my rock." Psalm 92, verse 14 to 15. The end. If this story touched your heart, go ahead and like this video, subscribe, and stay with me for more Christ-centered love stories filled with healing, hope, and the kind of love only God can write. And if you don't want to miss the next story, turn on your notifications so you'll be here when the next chapter begins. Until next time, keep believing in the grace of God that still defies all odds.